let's do something a little bit different today. Fate Requiem is one of the most recent entries in the Fate franchise. It's currently only in light novel format and only has 2 volumes available. I will say it's short so far. You're not going to get a lot out of it compared to the full lore dumps you have for something like Fate Apocrypha or Grand Order. That's just not a thing yet, so it flies under a lot of people's radar outside of the very recent collab event that occurred in FGO-NA and 2 years ago now in FGO-JP. I didn't want to make this an off-the-shelf because it's so new and so recent that for Seki Reacts we haven't done a lot of the servants in there, so it'd be kind of stealing from that a little bit. And because there's not a lot to cover, it'd be very unsatisfying for Seki, I think, if we tried to do 1 volume and leave it there. So we're just not going to do that on Off the Shelf anytime soon. So just that's why we're doing this today. For the first half of this video, I'm going to be trying to keep this mostly spoiler-free. I will say right off the bat that this is a brand new direction for the Fate franchise. No other work is quite like the one we're covering today. Fate Requiem was written by an author named Medio Hoshizora. I don't know a lot about this author, but from what little research I did, it appears this author was very influential in a lot of Nasu's early works, which is very interesting that now they're taking a crack at a work that, like, Fate's a franchise that they inspired, and they're coming back and now doing work on that franchise. That's really cool. Apparently this author is now fully employed with Type Moon, similar to the author of Strange Fake, whose name eludes me at the moment, actually. But it seems like they have quite the history in the visual novel market, and not that much outside of that, actually. They have a few things here and there, and apparently they're supposed to be the person in charge of writing girls' work, which will be supposedly an anime that Ufotable is adapting. I don't necessarily think we're ever going to get that, but if I'm honest here, from what I understand about girls' work, this might very well be spiritually, like the spiritual successor to what that was supposed to be, because if I remember it, girls' work was supposed to be a work by Type Moon that was a little bit, like, it took Shinjuku and made it weird. And that's about all we know about it, is it's Shinjuku, but weird. And that about describes Fate Requiem. It's Japan, but weird. So I have to wonder if girls' work ultimately became Fate Requiem in the end. So for Fate Requiem itself, the plot here, or at least the setup, will be generally familiar to anyone who's played the FGO event, but I'll go ahead and go over it in brief here. The world is flooded. Global warming is in fact a thing, and we fucked ourselves over. So Japan is now a series of island cities, because let's be honest here, if the world floods, Japan is the first to go.
So you're saying it's an archipelago?
It's already an archipelago, I think.
I'm making a joke.
An archipelago.
And a more archipelago.
But besides that, something else scarily possible happened. World War III. But World War III coincided with a Holy Grail War. I think it's the Fuyuki one, but I don't think that's ever made fully clear. However, at the end of the Grail War, whatever wish was made on the Grail gave literally everybody in the world, or at least in Japan, their own Holy Grail. As time goes on, there's 2 generations of people. People who were given the Grail by the war, and people who were not given the Grail by the war. The people who were given the Grail by the war, their Grail is a little bit more temporary. They get the standard 3 command seals, and they can summon a servant if they wish. And they have minor wish-granting abilities that they can use those command seals for. So it allows them to have some immortality, because they can wish on the Grail, I want to be young again. And thus they were young. More scary are their descendants, who are born with Grails in them as a biological fact. They're downright immortal. They cannot be killed, and yes, they still can summon servants. everyone kind of has their own, it seems like, partner servant. So you get a lot of familiar faces here and there. I won't go over specific names, so that remains a surprise to anyone reading. But you will see some familiar faces, especially as we get into later parts of the plot. Everyone has a grail except for one person, actually. Aris Utsumi is a girl who was born without a grail and born with weird fucky-wucky powers. Those powers make her sort of a Grim Reaper of servants, because obviously you have all these historical figures running around. Not all of them particularly respectful of the current world. And if any of them run too far afoul, she's supposed to kill them. I'll get into that a little bit more later when I get into spoilers, but it places her in this really interesting place in this particular world. Our story kind of picks up in the middle of one of those missions where she's dealing with an unruly servant. And in that particular mission, through unknown circumstances, she meets a young little boy servant whose identity is at this point unknown, and is weird because Aris should not be able to summon a servant, yet here he is before her. That's our general setup. Servants in this series are used very differently than they are in the rest of Fate, or even Type Moon in general. I think a few have appeared here and there elsewhere. But servants here are... they're just another type of person, really. They are effectively like elves in a fantasy world. They're a little bit more rare than the average person, but they are running around. So you can have... what's a random historical figure that I don't think appears here? You can have Paul Revere running around town delivering newspapers, in theory. They still have all their servant stats, so if you're familiar with the servants in FGO, you're still going to see their stats and abilities. They can still fight. They are still very armed and very dangerous. But the deal is they're supposed to integrate into society along with their masters. So you sometimes have deals where the servant actually serves the master, but it also seems like the servant at times can just go away from the master and leave the master be. I'm not sure. We haven't gotten too much on all of them yet, but we do see situations where people have to question whether or not who they're talking to is a servant or whether or not it's a normal person. Now, in particular, this world's funny because, as you probably noticed, outside of Aris hunting servants, which is not the majority of the series, actually, you wouldn't think there's a lot of room for servant fighting, sort of the staple of Fate at this point. Well, in the series, there are constantly running tournaments called the Holy Grail Tournaments. The announcers of which are servants and familiar faces, and I love that scene, but we'll get to spoilers when we get there. But yeah, no, they're fought like for competitive sports. It's like Pokemon or Beyblade. Like, this is just a fact of the world that there are historical figures that run around and battle for our entertainment and sport. Sign me up. One of the more interesting things here is that I did mention earlier that Aris is killing servants, but it's almost more like her first goal is not to kill servants. Her first goal is to get that servant out of the situation that they're currently putting people in. So if she can get servants out of town instead of having to kill them, she tries to. So it's almost more like social workers or cops trying to talk people down from doing something stupid than just, you're bad, dead. So I actually really like that. It allows the servants to be explored in a way that you don't really get to see a lot in the Fate series. Because in the Fate series, they do make the distinction that these servants are not people, they should not be treated as people. And it's only in situations like Grand Order, where the servants are only really around as characters in the events. Sometimes in the story, they're a little bit more there as a fact, but usually they're there as a tool either for the villains or the heroes, or they're not servants at all in that particular chapter. Here the servants are people. They are people. They are treated as people. They are dealt with as people. And that's just a different direction altogether. I really like that. If you're a Fate fan, you're probably asking, where does this series connect to the overarching, like, Fate lore? I'm gonna be honest here, I don't know. So far, we only have one vague reference to Fuyuki here. So, at this time, this is not like Apocrypha or even Grand Order, where there's a very clear space where this diverges. We don't know, and I kind of like it that way. I'm kind of happy we have a series that almost serves as its entirely own thing in this sort of mess of series and sub-series. So it feels like a bit of a fresh start, and I do like that aspect. Actually, I'll say this series, more than anything, excites me. Because this is just not a Fate world. The Fate world exists in its own urban fantasy sort of paradigm of storytelling. It's in the urban fantasy genre. Fate Requiem is not urban fantasy. The world is so dramatically different. It almost falls straight into the fantasy, like a specific type of fantasy. I don't want to call it sci-fi. I don't want to call it urban, but it's certainly not urban fantasy. I'm not quite sure what to call it. It exists in the same realm as some... I've seen some shonen like this, where the world has aspects of our own. Something like Full Metal Alchemist, I guess, would be a good comparison. Where you can see aspects that are similar to our own, but it is so far removed from the normal that you don't really call Full Metal Alchemist an urban fantasy. But you still see some elements here that's like, no, this is just a world that went a very different direction. It kind of exists like that. And that way I'd almost say this is probably the most Shonen Fate series. If anything, just with the tournament arcs. The character, although it's a female character, this character is, I want to say, 14. This character exists in that sort of shonen age range for the ideal protagonist. It even falls into some tropes of shonen, where the character is... I don't want to say asexual, because this could change immediately, but asexual. The character actively makes reference to that they don't really understand the point of that, which, if there's anything of a shonen, it's a character that either is asexual or too dense to be involved in romantic relationships that the author has to write. So, that's a thing. Honestly, I've got to say, this series of all the Fate spin-offs that are currently ongoing is probably the one that I'm most excited to see where it goes. The fact that it's so different, the fact that I'm not just seeing another Holy Grail war play out, that truly excites me as a Fate fan, because I do feel in some ways the franchise has gotten just a little bit repetitive as far as its spin-offs go. The Fate question is old as time. Can you start here? And the answer that's old as time, it's complicated. On one hand, this is a brand new interpretation of Fate. It is so unlike any other interpretation of Fate we've had so far that I almost say it's as different to what we know of Fate right now as different iterations of something like Digimon are between each other. Yes, it's the same franchise, but we're almost playing under a completely different rulebook here. You're not going to need to know the previous iteration to understand this. So in that way, yes, if you're looking for a jumping on point, at least to what I can see right now, this is possibly one of the best ones written so far because it has the least baggage attached to it. But there is a debate that circulates around a lot of entries that, like, let's jump to Fate Zero here. I always have to bring this back to Fate Zero. Fate Zero was a great jumping on point for the casual anime fan. It was written dramatically different from Fate Stay Night, which made it more appealing to a lot of general fans, though. And that, while it made it better for jumping on, it also made it harder to transition into other Fate works. Fate Requiem, being so unlike other Fate works, is almost a double-edged sword here. On one hand, it's got nothing attached to it. On the other hand, you might not, like, if you enjoy a specific aspect of the series, you might not enjoy say, Fate Stay Night, or Fate Zero, or Apocrypha. There's so much that's removed from this entry, at least as of Volume 1. That jumping onto any other Fate entry might just be difficult. Off the top of my head, only maybe Grand Order can be jumped on from this, and that's because Grand Order, its events sort of have that same feeling of these servants are people and characters in the world. But as I say in a lot of my videos that sort of go over getting into Fate or Fate timeline or Fate, like looking at the Fate baggage situation, I don't think it should really matter. If you're looking to get into Fate and you want something that's a little bit more, I'll say, shonen than you typically get with your average Fate entry, then this is actually probably a good starting point. I think I'll go ahead and say definitively this is probably a good starting point. And if you're a Fate fan looking for something new, this is a good entry to check out, actually. I think this one is a little bit more overlooked than it probably should be. So if you're looking for a new light novel, Knick Knack strongly recommends Fate Requiem. Okay, on to the spoilers. Le spoiler. If you're interested in this series, I'm going to give you a backwards count of 3 before I get started here. So go away now if you want to check this series out, or if you're curious about anything about this series and would prefer to experience it on your own. 3, 2. So first off here, Voyager. We know from FGO that Voyager is, in fact, the Voyager space shuttle. And while that is probably a spoiler for Book 2, I'm gonna be honest, having that knowledge retroactively, it's made extremely obvious in this book. Towards the end, there's a line where Voyager's name is dropped by the main character, Eris, and she does nothing to indicate that this was the class she was talking about. She just says Voyager, at least as far as the translation I was reading went. This surprises me because the entirety of the Fate fandom went on for months until that collab was announced, assuming that Voyager was in reference to the class, not the Voyager space shuttle. As well, Voyager just shows random interests in space and expresses knowledge about Jupiter's red spot. I don't know. Reading this, it just felt obvious if you only thought outside the box as far as to what a Fate servant could be. Maybe there was more speculation on this in the fandom when this first got announced, but I'm surprised I didn't see more of that. Instead, everyone seemed to latch on to the false theory that they call out as false in this book, that Voyager might be the little prince from, I think it's a poem, a short story. Seki? Do you know what the Little Prince is?
Little Prince is it's an old folktale short story. It's by someone pretty famous, I think, or maybe it's the story itself. The Little Prince is, it's written by someone famous. So it's written by Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, and it is a French story. It's a novella officially. Fun fact: he was a military aviator.
Neat.
Yeah, but written in the 40s, so World War II era. And I think that's why it's such a fucking depressing story.
Thank you, Seki, for your random Seki trivia. That said, Voyager was kind of weird to me because he just kind of appears. The main character just kind of dies and he appears. It's kind of like the Shiro thing from Fate Stay Night, where Shiro was... It wasn't Saber that saved Shiro, but he still died before then, came back and later was contracted to Saber. That same kind of thing happens. In fact, the main character gets impaled with a lance, like Shiro did. There's some parallels there, clearly. But we don't really, in this book, get any explanation as to where the fuck he came from. So I'm curious to see if the later books touch on that, or if this is just something we're going to have to take for a fact. I imagine he's a lot more important than this initial book makes out, because he was not very important to this book. Like, he was there, he was the driving plot, I guess. But I guess that kind of gets into the nature of this plot. This plot was not action heavy at all, actually. It was very slice of life, almost, with the main character and her friend. I'll get into her friend a bit later, but Aris and her friend just kind of going around. I believe they are in Shinjuku, actually. Are they in Shinjuku? Or are they in... No, they're in Akihabara. They're in Akihabara. They're going around this new above-water Akihabara and interacting with the world. There's more world-building than anything else here, actually. Alright, so her friend, Karen. I actually really like Karen. So these are 14-year-old girls we're talking about. So I was pleasantly surprised that Karen didn't turn around and start babbling on about dark philosophy or whatever that you sometimes get with protagonists in fantasy stories, even if they're... Because they behaviorally act like 14-year-olds. Karen hears that Aris doesn't like the Holy Grail tournaments. She finds them distasteful. And instead of having the normal human reaction of, to each their own, she almost straight up fucking strangles Aris for dissing her favorite sport. I love that aspect because having been in many arguments, as an adult even, over small personal preferences, those are the things you want to rip your friends' necks out of their bodies the most about. So, as with everyone in this world, Karen has a servant as well. Karen's servant is a Japanese figure named Kyokoyo. I actually don't know much about her myself. All I know is that fate made her a motherfucking T-Rex. I need more motherfucking T-Rex. I do want to jump back to Aris here because Aris as a character fascinates me. Partially because I don't know what the fuck is going on with her, but I know what she calls... Because her power is this weird evil spirit thing that almost acts as like a negative influence on her, telling her to act on her worst impulses. It's weird. I don't know much about it yet. At least I don't remember much about it from the novel, but they do touch on it, and they do hint at stuff to come with it in the future. And the FGO event, through that, I know these things are kind of assholes. But this is what got me to read the book, actually. She calls the spirits the Der Elkanog, or the Der Erlkanog, based off of a poem and I forget what the specific type of music is called. It's a specific musical piece that was written about a... I want to say it translates to the Fairy King or the Elf King, and that's not quite correct.
Was it a ditty or a folk song?
It's kind of a folk song. It was made sort of in the Renaissance, I believe.
Okay.
But it's not quite correct to call it the Fairy King or the Elf King. But it's a character I want in Fate to be a thing. But this character, in the poem and in the song, preys on... He's supposed to be a stand-in for not... What's the term? Not... In the song, it's sort of treated as a you need to pay attention to when children are scared kind of thing. But I believe it's supposed to be, as a character, a warning for children not to interact with strangers. Because in some versions of the poem, I believe, when he goes to children, he kidnaps them and brings them to his wife and daughters. In other versions, I believe, he finds the children and lures them in before killing them. He's an interesting, very under-the-radar sort of old, scary story that I love that they're referencing that here, and I'm curious to see if that actually ends up connecting at all. One thing I have to speculate on about Aris herself, though, is she couldn't summon a servant. At least she didn't have the Holy Grail in her and get the immortal command seals. She treats this as sort of a disability almost, because you're the only person in the world at this point without immortality, effective immortality. So it's interesting to see her perspective on how people interact with those command seals and how they interact with her servants. She seems like truly happy to finally have a servant of her own when she meets Voyager, and she starts to really connect with him. But I'm going to speculate here and now, partially because of the FGO event, partially because of what I've seen here, that she is a servant or in some way related to a servant. Because we know from Fate Stay Night with Medea and Saseki Kojiro, servants can be contracted with other servants through roundabout means. So I'm wondering if Aris here is a servant, because even in FGO, there's an entire little joke. It's treated as a joke, because she's summonable as a servant in FGO. There's an entire joke about how she doesn't actually realize she's a servant through most of the event, and that kind of colors most of her decision-making in that event for the worse. So I have to wonder if, in Fate Requiem as well, if she's actually some type of servant. We do have a few more characters here. These ones are a little bit less used in the story than Aris, Kyokoyo, Voyager, and Karen. We have another character named Karen. That doesn't get confusing at all. She's mostly unimportant. It seems like she's an administrator to the city kind of thing. I get the idea this is a Nurse Joy situation. But we'll see going forward with this story. We don't get much with her, though. She kind of dies at the end. And we also get another character named Koharu. Koharu's interesting because she's a homunculus by a wealthy family that basically runs the Holy Grail tournaments. There's definitely more to her story. This is where I can see things going full Fate. Her servant, though, is unusual. Or maybe a little bit too usual. She is contracted with Galahad Alter. A saber servant, I believe, in this case. But Galahad doesn't fight as a servant. Galahad is a servant who walks around. But when the time comes to fight, he just gives Koharu his powers, MASH style? Is this just something that Galahad does now? Is Galahad so lazy he just makes other people fight for him? I thought this was just a thing that MASH was able to do. I'm curious to see if that ever gets fleshed out, or if this was just a roundabout reference to MASH and T.H.E. The other servant pair here are Chitose and Lucius/Longinus. I think they're the same person here, but I think they keep switching around what they refer to them as. They're interesting because it's clear they know a lot more than they're letting on here. We don't get much other than, I believe that they are Aris's, was it grandmother? I think we get a little bit of that, but she's the same age as Aris due to the immortality aspect. I want to know what's going on there. There are some cryptic things said that are... I don't think she's necessarily a good guy in this story, even though she's mostly a protagonist in this story for the volume we've seen so far, up till around the end where she does something absolutely dickish. So here's a fun fact. I think I cursed this video. Originally, I recorded this all on our new set. This is actually the second take of Fate Requiem. The first take was lost to a corruption error. Well, the second take, I lost about a fifth of it to a corruption error, about the last 10 minutes. Thankfully, we're almost done here, so I'll just continue where I left off, except now you guys only get to hear my voice and see whatever pretty pictures I put up on screen. So, where I left off is I was actually just about to get into Nizambi. I'm actually a huge fan of Nizambi, because in the volume that I read, Nizambi basically just caused a zombie apocalypse within the arena. It was basically the setup for the climax, but this entire volume, they're just building her up as this serial killer that goes around and kills people and steals their hands in order to hold on to their command spells. That's fucking rad. I don't like that language. Ooh, I should cut that. So I'm not sure that Nizambi is going to be the main villain of this entire thing. I have a strong feeling that by the end of this series, we're going to have another villain who's actually kind of hinted at in this book. I think I've read who that villain is, but they didn't really say him by name, so I'm not going to say him here. At least not to my memory, they didn't say him by name. I do hope we get to see more of her, though, because, man, what we saw of her left its impact. I would like to say that I love her design, but I'm actually of literally two minds in it. There's two different designs of her I saw. The first one was an in-book illustration of her, and it was really cool. She's all got this cloak on, the hands hanging off of her. She's holding her noble phantasm dagger that I think she uses to turn people into zombies, or at least start out the zombie apocalypse. And then there's the design on the Tight Moon Wiki, which I think is from Volume 2. That design I'm less of a fan of, but I have a feeling that's more of the angle that they get her at. I don't think that's her common outfit. It's just a selective camera angle and a selective pose. That's actually about all I have for today, to be honest. Genuinely, I think this series could be just a complete fresh of breath air, one the Fate series has kind of needed for a while now. I think we've all heard the talk about how Fate really didn't need to go on past Stay Night, and the debate's there. I personally enjoy Grand Order in the expanded Fate universe, but I can see why some people might not. But I think this is just different enough to where it doesn't feel like we're retreading old territory this time. That's another Grand Order, but Grand Order's a gacha game, so this thankfully is not yet a gacha game. Alright, so closing this video out, I wanted to go ahead and just say that this is a little one-off review that I just felt like doing, because I wanted to talk about just a completely underlooked entry into the Fate franchise. I've read a few more smaller entries around here, or I've seen a few more, so if you'd like me to talk about them separate from the channel, separate from our off-the-shelf, because we're not going to get around to a lot of those on off-the-shelf anytime soon outside of some of the Case Files stuff, and maybe Strange Fake, then I'll go ahead and give it a go. I've already recorded a video on FGO, I believe has already gone up actually, the retrospective on FGO, and I plan to record a comprehensive set of reviews of the Fate Stay Night routes that I'm currently slowly, and I mean very slowly, making my way through. And then I probably will actually put out a channel review for MiHoYo when it comes out in the West. I'm actually very excited for that. And yeah, just in the comments, give me suggestions here. Let me know if there's anything you particularly like to see in these little one-off videos. I can't promise I'll get around to them all, especially if you're requesting, say, a visual novel. I would love to read something like Fate Hollow or Oxia one day, but visual novels take a little bit longer than light novels, unfortunately. But I will try to do as much as I can here, just on the channel, by myself. Alright, well, until next time, everyone, I don't really have an outro for this. Try harder, I guess. I need more motherfucking T-Rex mommy in my life. Please.
And you judged me for being into Hot Croc Mama when we watched you judged me for Hot Croc Mama, and you're sitting over here simping over Rexy.
What can I say? I grew up with Jurassic Park.
And I grew up with the Crocodile Hunter.